Okay, good morning. Yesterday we looked at the poem You Being Born, and today is our first lesson writing about poetry properly. So our title is Writing About Poetry. Get it down and underline it, make it neat, make it beautiful. Then our learning objective is to explain the big idea of a poem's narrative using a clear thesis statement. I'll just give you a second to get that down as well. So, when we talk about a thesis, we want to spell it correctly for a start. We're talking about the big idea of something. It's your argument. It's your light bulb moment. It's your understanding of the text. Okay? And you want to lay it out in a logical and clear argument. Logical and clear argument. Okay? And the best writing about poetry follows some kind of a pattern, and it's that pattern we're going to have a look at when we're going to work out our thesis. So roughly, a thesis statement goes a little bit like this. So you have your big idea and a sentence about your big idea, which sums up the whole of the poem. Okay. Then you have a colon, and then you break that down into three parts. So you would have part number one, clever idea number one, that you break it down into. Then you have clever idea number two that you break it down into. And then finally, you have clever idea number three. And the really lovely thing about this is it kind of goes a bit beginning, middle, end. How does the narrative of the poem develop? And that's the best way of thinking about it. So you're kind of tracing or following the most logical pattern. And the logical pattern is trace the development of the poem in three parts. And that's what we're going to look at today. Now, an example we could take from An Inspector Calls could look a little bit like this. So we could say our model, although it will be about something different, it won't be about a poem, would be An Inspector Calls. I'm thinking, what's An Inspector Calls about? Well, I know it's didactic. It's teaching a story, teaching a message to us. It's teaching a moral to us as well, and it's critiquing. Who's it critiquing? It's critiquing the bourgeoisie and their lack of responsibility. So my big idea is going to try and pull all of those things into one. So, An Inspector Calls is a didactic morality play used to challenge and critique what are they challenging and critiquing? Well, I guess it's the privilege of the bourgeoisie. Okay? So that's my initial statement. That's my big idea, right? That sums up the play. That's what it is. That's what it does. Okay? Then I need to break that down into three different parts. So I'm thinking part one. Okay, what does Priestley do first? Priestley, great. He reveals the incompetence of Mr. Burling and the abuse and the firing of Eva Smith by Sheila and their exploitation of Eva Smith's labour. So I'm going to sum that up as my first big idea. So it reveals their incompetence and exploitation of proletarian labour. And what's the next thing? Well, I guess they also treat Eva in a particularly dehumanising way, and they treat her body in a particularly dehumanising way. So I guess the next bit would be something along the lines of their dehumanising abuse of the working class body. And then my last one, well, what do they do finally? Well, the last thing that they do is that they refuse to take responsibility for their actions. So that's my last big idea that I need to talk about if I'm talking about an Inspector Calls. And well, I think I'm probably going to need a better pen than that one. And finally, how they must take responsibility for their actions, or what will happen? They'll be punished. How will they be punished? In fire and blood and anguish. Okay, so I'll add that in. Be punished in fire and blood and anguish. Lovely. So here I've got my thesis, my big idea, and this is where I then break it down into broken down idea 1, this idea of the incompetence and exploitation, broken it down into big idea number 2, which is the abuse of the working class body, and number 3, third idea is they need to take responsibility. So those are the things that make up my argument. So when we look at a poem, we need to go through a similar process of what's the big idea, what's it about, and then how do we break that down into 3 simpler and chunked ideas that we can analyse and talk about. So, yesterday's poem was You Being Born by Brian Jones. And if we have a look back at it again, we can remember some really clear things about it. Okay, well, we know that the big idea of the poem is from the point of view of Jones, of a father, and that this is a moment of happiness and joy. So we can be really, really clear when we say the point of view, father. We can really be clear we talk about the tone. We're really, really clear that that is joy, and that it's transformative. He changes. His life is no longer the same. And also we know what's happening is he's actually witnessing it. He's telling the story of witnessing this birth. Okay, well, now we need to think what happens in the poem. How are we going to chunk that down into something manageable that we can turn into a thesis statement? Well, that's tricky, but it's less tricky than you might think. So let's have a look again. So we know this first paragraph talks about really specific things. Okay, this idea the child shot out like a rugby ball from a scrum. We have this imagery of speed, and chaos, and a bit of violence. Then the second section, we have this wrinkled jammy head, these spasmy legs, and this white root that comes out from the belly button. We have this child that looks a bit strange and a bit otherworldly, but is still beautiful. Okay? It's not superficial in the way that it talks about the child. It's not perfect. There's no veneer covering the truth of things here. Then we've got this next section about how he forgets the mum. I forgot your mother completely. And so he forgets his previous life. And actually, who is it that replaces the previous life? Well, we know by the time we get to the end down here that it's this child, this pool of growing light who's arrived. So we can link these two together here. Forgets previous life, and the child becomes central. So our ideas go from that into something more direct and something more manageable. So if we're talking about the flow, the narrative of the poem, if we're going to trace the development of the poem in 3 parts, it actually becomes a lot simpler now. And it can start to look a little bit more like this. You see there's a direction to this poem. It starts right at the beginning. We've got the chaos and violence of the act of birth itself, of the pushing. Then it moves on to the next section that's really important of this poem. And this arrival of this strange otherworldly creature. The child, like a beautiful alien. And then lastly, we've got this fact that this arrival changes his life forever. Transforms and forgets. So at this point, we can also say that when we talk about the chaos and violence of birth, we can use our vocabulary, but we've used part of it already. We've used chaos. We can also say that there's no veneer. Okay, there's no hiding the reality of birth. Okay, it's messy, it's hard. It's like a game of rugby. We can say that despite the fact that the child is otherworldly and kind of wrinkled and looks like a frog, we can say that it's not superficial. Regardless, this isn't some perfect child that has popped out, but he loves it anyway. We all feel that. Yet by the end, his life is transformed and things are different. And so we can say that it is or it isn't idealised. Well, I think we're probably saying that it is idealised. And he's showing it here also as a privilege. A privilege to be there and a privilege to witness it. So now we've got the poem broken down into 3 sections. We've got some great vocabulary that we can articulate our ideas with. What we now need to have a think about is what can you do with that now? So that's the easy bit, where you put your ideas together and you can see something valuable. So let's write this thesis statement now. So get that down. I'm just going to underline it with a lovely squiggly line. If you've got a ruler, use a ruler. Now I'm going to start really simply. I'm going to start like this. In the poem, you being born Jones explores the, well, now what emotions do I know it's about? Well, if I look at this and I look at my notes from before, I know that it's about joy and transformation, okay? So that's what I'm going to put. In the poem You Being Born, Jones explores the joy and transformative moment of a father witnessing what are they witnessing? It was the actual birth of their child. Okay, now it is revealed to be three things. Let's work out what they are in some really, really beautiful clauses. Now, this is your challenge. It's revealed to be what? So the first thing, tell me what it's revealed to be, and think about the idea of chaos versus order. What's changed in the life? Or what is it that's different about the act of birth? We might think it should be like this, but really it's like this, or vice versa. Think about adding the word veneer. Is there a veneer here or not? Number two, we've got this focus on the child. What the child looks like, the child arriving. Is it superficial or not? Number three, we have the transformation. That's easy to say, but you have to say what changes. You have to describe that to me. What changes? And then what I want you to add is you can explain why that privilege, why that change is a privilege. And finally, this whole thing, despite some of the chaotic moments, despite some of the more otherworldly descriptions, it is also idealized. How is that? And what you want to do is you want to put those into your last three sections, your last three clauses of your thesis statement.